Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last panel of this year's conference. My name is Carolina, and I will be the chair of this session. And as always, each presenter has 20 minutes for their presentation. And at the end, we will have about 30 minutes for the question and answers. This session is titled The Middle Ages in Popular and Digital Media, Approaches to Gender. Our first presenter is Amy Burcher, who is a recent MA graduate from the Center of Medieval Studies at the University of York. Having written about dress and gender in both her MA and BA dissertations, she has a strong interest in these topics. She has had practical experience in designing and producing historical costumes and hair for student theater and has been a long-time follower of the online historical costuming community. Since graduating, she has volunteered at the National Trust Red House, built by William Morris and once host to many of his arts and crafts and pre-Raphaelite peers. Engaging with the house, its collection and its history has opened up an interest in this period and style of art. Amy will present a paper titled Radiant as the Tresses of Aurora, the pre-Raphaelite impact on popular depictions of medieval women's hair and gender. Amy, you can start whenever you're ready. Amy, please unmute yourself.
Amy, you're muted. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
yes.
There you are.
Okay, sorry about that. Can you all see the presentation?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. As said, my presentation is on Radiant as the Tresses of Aurora, the pre-Raphaelite impact on popular depictions of medieval women's hair and gender. My objectives with this paper are to find pre-Raphaelite on the screen, to think about the gendered relationships between pre-Raphaelites and hair, think about how this impacts how we view medieval women on screen, and bring in aspects of thinking about the male gaze and how it impacts visual language. One of my inspirations when preparing this paper was Amy Kaufman's essay in the 2020 collection Women on Film, where she writes about the character of Jenny in 1967's Camelot. She talks about how this character's hair changes as the character's agency changes throughout the film, and this was something I wanted to explore in more detail with this paper. Just a quick definition of the pre-Raphaelite. As I understand, it's a very specific art movement. It's an art movement very specific to the England and the UK in the late to mid 19th century. The original movement was founded by the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, technically only operated between the 1848 and 1852, and involved artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Holman Hunt, and John Everett Millais, although there's a widely recognised second wave in the 1860s with artists like William Morris, Edward Burne-Jones, and Ford Madox Brown. I'm taking a broader approach to this term, considering the wider aesthetic impact of the movement and impact on artists that weren't technically ever part of the Brotherhood, as well as the impact on dress and style of the period. The film I want to look at to begin with is 2018's Ophelia. It's based on a book by the same name by Lisa Klein and is inspired by the Shakespeare play. It's set in a vaguely historic Denmark, but all the visual cues in the film come from John Everett Millais' painting of Ophelia from 1851 to 1852. The painting is recreated in the opening shot and later in the sequence where Ophelia drowns in what is the high point of drama in the film. In the latter sequence, there are lots of lingering shots on Ophelia, and in particular of her hair in the water, and hair imagery is a large part of this film and forms part of the language that happens between the romance between Ophelia and Hamlet in this film. The pre-Raphaelite aesthetic influence can be seen outside of just this one moment. and the use of strong, rich colours and pre-Raphaelite sort of stylistic influence can be seen throughout the film. Even the actress's hair, which wears this distinctive red wig that's waved, is distinctively pre-Raphaelite. Had always historically been unfashionable with figures like Judas going back to medieval times. It wasn't until the 1860s really, and the pre-Raphaelites and their paintings, where we had what Galeotte dubs the Red Revolution, with the fashionability of this hair colour. While the film is unique in being directly influenced by pre-Raphaelite paintings, there's very little about it necessarily that is visually distinctive or that doesn't have a lot in common with other modernist medievalist films, especially historical and historical fantasy films. The blog recycled movie costumes, for example, has tracked the costumes, so the headpiece worn by Ophelia in the bottom corner of the screen has since been reused in another Renaissance era film, 2022's Rosaline, whereas the dress worn by Gertrude in the film has already been seen, was originally made for 2005's Tristan and Isolde, was then reused in Vikings, the third series, and then used in this film. So there's a lot of through line in the aesthetic and costuming between this film and others. There's a through line in these aesthetic influences between these films. For the pre-Raphaelites, hair was more than just an aesthetic element, and it takes on elements of fetishization. Rossetti in particular has been acknowledged for the element of fetishization of hair in his work, dubbed by Allen as reaching the proportions of fetish and forming a consistent visual theme throughout his work. This is something more broadly recognized in their book on hair, Perry and Chang, there, serving as a powerful vehicle for all sorts of anxieties and social prescriptions, forming a subjective and historically consistent vocabulary of subjective identification and performative expression. Hair becomes something more than just an element of the body, and takes on value judgments and characteristics, especially when attached to women. The quote from the beginning of this paper comes from Rossetti himself when writing to his sister about a lock of hair given as a love token to him. He describes it as possessing magical qualities and possessing qualities beyond the ordinary, and it becomes something beyond just a token of affection, but a sacrifice of something far more powerful that he's reveling in. And especially with the gendered language of hair, this becomes something really important. Writing about hair in Victorian visual culture, Deborah Cherry describes hair as coming to define rather than just describe the feminine, and it places them along these broad axes of sexuality and danger to good sort of trustworthiness. Almost all women in pre-Raphaelite paintings are beautiful. There's a prerequisite for beauty in their art. That was a lot of the emphasis, and Swinburne, for example, talked about Rossetti worshipping beauty for beauty's sake. Along these axes, you have a variety of portrayals of womanhood. So you have the idea of Lady Lilith. She is one of the ultimate, she is high on the scale of sexuality, but also high on the scale of danger. Her hair is depicted
Amy, sorry.
So I'm just my computer connected.
Your voice is breaking. Maybe your connection is not that stable. Maybe it would be a better idea if you turn off your camera. Maybe that might make it a little bit more stable. Okay, let's give it a try from there. Thank you.
Is that any better?
It seems so. Let's give it a try. Thank you.
God, let's turn back on again. Sorry. Lady Lilith, she's a dangerous woman who knows her own beauty. There's a quote from Goethe that's connected to the painting, describing her as having magical hair, which is directly a danger to the male viewer. In contrast, you have the figure of the Lady of Shalott, who is a woman who is destroyed by her own dangerous sexuality. In Holman Hunt's painting, her magical hair and her weaving ensnare her. Holman Hunt considered the painting to be a parable of the danger of what happened when a woman lost her interest in spirituality on an axis of worldly desire. In contrast, you have the figure of Enid Arthur Hughes' painting of the Brave Geraint. She's a woman whose hair is, while on display in the painting, directly serves her male part, and is beautiful within the axis of a domesticated and respectable relationship. In contrast, you also have the axis of respectability. So you have figure of Aurelia, who is Vasio's mistress. She's painted as another femme fatale, another model, painting modelled from Fanny Cornforth, and she is distinctly a non-respectable woman. In contrast, you have Clara von Bork, a figure from the 1849 novel. This painting was modelled on Georgiana Burne-Jones, the painter's wife, and is everything a woman should be, respectable, and her hair is entirely controlled. In the centre, you have the figure of Sidonia von Bork, who is the ultimate figure of anxiety. While her hair appears to be controlled and her sexuality appears to be controlled, this is just an illusion of her respectability, and viewers of the painting would know that the danger that this figure represents, hiding her dangerous sexuality behind this facade of respectability. The pre-Raphaelite relationship with hair very much connects with their relationship with the medieval. It's important to recognise the through line and the consistency within Western religious culture, reusing ideas recycled by medieval societies, in turn then celebrated by the early modern period, arguably right up to the present. Millikan writing their book on medieval hair. The same religious quotes were still being used. For example, Corinthians was repeated. This quote from Corinthians was repeatedly appeared in my research, both in the Victorian idea of hair and also in the medieval idea of hair. The pre-Raphaelites looked to the medieval and looked to the medieval relationships when creating their paintings. However, one thing that is notably visibly absent from pre-Raphaelite paintings are headdresses and any sort of idea of headdresses. This goes back to the pre-Raphaelite value of beauty. Quite simply, a lot of the time, pre-Raphaelites didn't depict these kind of elements because they didn't find them visually beautiful. They didn't please them. What is absent here is a recognition that while women's headdresses medieval women's headdresses had an origin in ideas of modesty and decorum, they became objects with which they could display their hair and face, and objects of display of their character and their wealth. And this element of agency is missing in a lot of pre-Raphaelite art, especially those depicted by male artists. Finally, I want to explore what this recreation of the pre-Raphaelite aesthetic in modern period dramas, medieval dramas, can mean when we're considering the female characters in them. These three series are all Philippa Gregory adaptations. They're all connected through the production company Stars. Despite spanning a large time period between 1464 and 1525, there's a very the aesthetic and visual hairstyling changes very little between the shows, with all of the characters sporting the sort of loose pre-Raphaelite-esque wave. I'm going to focus in particular on the White Queen, as it's the most distinctively medieval and doesn't go into the Tudor like the other two shows. One of the notable moments of hair symbolism within the show or within the coronation scenes. We have two coronation scenes, the first being Elizabeth Woodville, in which her hair is worn loose. This does have a nod towards historical accuracy, as women could wear their hair loose for a coronation, but is also seen as a moment of female empowerment within the show, and is one of the visual high points of the show, and something that we see as very positive. In the second coronation, the coronation of Anne Neville, her hair is worn back in a tight braid, We feel far more ambiguous about this coronation, and it is less a celebration of the character's power and more a reflection of our ambiguity around Richard III, but also our ambiguity around Anne as she's become increasingly paranoid and increasingly less stable by this point in the show. So while she is a respectable woman within her respectable marriage, and she is far less sexually active or sexually aggressive than the character of Elizabeth Woodville, she's seen as being almost repressed in her depiction. Forms the heroine of the show, and in this scene where she mourns her husband, the lighting of the scene emphasizes her golden hair. Despite the fact this is it's supposed to be a scene which is very emotionally raw and emotionally sad for her, she's still made visibly attractive to the audience, and this lighting in particular brings to mind earlier romantic scenes which use this sort of high contrast lighting. Here she is a full tragic romantic heroine. Despite her vulnerability, she remains attracted to the camera and to us as the audience. All the characters within the show, within the Woodville family, the female characters are all practicing witches in the show. It's an element of the historical fiction of the show. However, during these scenes, their hair tends to be worn loose and long, making use of the gold wigs, golden hair that they're wearing in the show. Again, the lighting tends to emphasize this golden hair, and it is seen as a connection to their feminine power. The witchcraft in the show is channeled through a matriarchal connection, and a matriarchal connection to the divine feminine and to the river goddess. Again, there's a very bioessentialist element to this, linking it to the idea of feminine power and feminine magic coming through these strands of hair. Whilst the pre-Raphaelites present this as a position of anxiety, the show is far more ambivalent towards it and presents it as a means of female agency. In contrast, we have the figure of Margaret Beaufort. She is positioned as a villain in Gregory's books and thus in the series. At the beginning of the series, we see her in relaxed braided looks. She is, at this point, one of the more complicated characters in the series, as well. We empathise with her situation, with a strained marriage and unable to live with her and son, who she clearly cares a lot about. She's still a character who's seen as quite extreme in her beliefs. However, by the end of the show, she is transitioned from a complex woman to an antagonist, and the end of the series, she is responsible for the murder of the princes of the Tower and playing all sides, actively deceiving our protagonist. And her hair is worn in these strict, tight styles, which is supposed to be reflective of her, in particular, her press. Into a sequel series, she is the only one considering wear headdresses, and these again are seen as a representative of her role as a conservative figure at court and a repressive, negatively portrayed woman. Do we escape the cycle of gendered hair? While Raphaelite paintings are perhaps more specifically reproduced for a male gaze and produced by predominantly male artists for a male art audience, and modern period dramas often have a more female-oriented audience. Going back to the original, Laura Marbley's original breakdown of the male gaze, it goes beyond the idea of men and women, but also the idea of passive womanhood versus the active gaze of men. And she points out how cinema creates a dimension of space and creates a gaze, a world, an object, thereby producing an illusion, the measure of desire. In many of these period dramas, we see the female characters in particular codified and created in a means of which fits both our moral perspective of the audience, but also the aesthetic of the audience, expected to appear to be beautiful, especially if they are good, no matter what they are going through within the show. They don't exist within their own element of agency, but they exist within a world of viewership, existing for the visual pleasure of the audience. Whilst we whilst the value system of morality and sexuality has changed, of those I really enjoyed, which is
Amy, I think we are losing.
There will clarify things about how we perceive them within these gendered axes. Or sorry.
I think we're losing you. Your voice is really breaking. Maybe you would like to repeat what you were saying regarding this particular slide, or maybe you would like to reiterate your conclusions because I'm not sure we were able to hear them.
Okay. So my conclusion essentially is going back to the idea of the male gaze. Whilst modern period dramas are often being produced for a more female audience, the women on screen are still produced as a passive element for the viewership of the audience, as a part of who has active gaze, despite experiencing emotional turmoil. Often women are consistently depicted in a way that is attractive to the audience, especially if they are a character that we expected to sympathize with. And this goes into how their hair continues to be codified. One quote comes from Galia describing the way in which hair codes can be shifted in their significations, and that although the way that the moral and ideological approach perhaps a modern audience comes to with hair, women are still placed along this axis of respectability and goodness, and that this is something perhaps when we are viewing, especially the depictions of women on screen, we should view with a more critical eye.
Thank you, Amy, for this presentation. I actually find it very interesting. Yes, please. Do you want to add anything?
Oh, no, that's fine. I've just got a brief bibliography if anyone is interested.
Okay. Thank you for this presentation. I find it very interesting how the male hair has been historically associated with their physical strength, but when it comes to women, there's this strong dichotomy. On one hand, making women appear as those dangerous villains, but on the other hand, those modest and respectable, but also to some extent as surreal. Our next presenter is Irina Manea, who holds MA in Ancient History and PhD in Viking Studies at the University of Bucharest. Currently, she's working as a history teacher in Germany, doing independent research and public instruction activities. She's a contributor to the Ancient History Encyclopedia. And she also has a small YouTube and TikTok channels where she talks about Norse religion and culture. She previously worked as a teacher for Scandinavian languages. Irina will present a paper titled "The Northman, Another Berserk on Screen." Irina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And I apologize for the fact that I will have to keep my camera turned off because I had a small glitch before, and I don't want it to get worse. But I am going to share my screen and I really hope it works. So can you see it? Or
yes.
Okay, just let me try to find okay, I think we can begin. Let me know if you cannot see the slides moving. All right, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about The Northman. That is Robert Eggers' third movie after The Witch and the Lighthouse, and his most expensive movie out of the three. So basically, this movie is a pounding, brutal Viking revenge tale rooted in the Scandinavian folk legend of Amleth. It is led by the Swedish actor Alexander Skarsgård as an exiled Icelandic prince out to avenge his father's murder and reclaim his kingdom. And it has pretty much all the blood and muscle you can possibly associate with the genre, plus an ensemble including Nicole Kidman as Amlet's mother, Ethan Hawke as his father, Anya Taylor-Joy as his love interest, and Claes Bank as his uncle. There is even a cameo from the Icelandic pop deity Björk, her first film in many years, I reckon. So the film boasts a rich historical idiom, rampant spirituality, and ambiguous heroism. And in order for us to understand better what it is about, I am going to try to present a little bit the context as in why Robert Eggers chose this topic after all. So Robert Eggers is himself the son of a Shakespeare professor. He was passionate about Conan the Barbarian, for example, as a child. He used to love comic books, and then that gave way to more esoteric interests, for example, the Renaissance, and then the engravings of Albrecht Dürer. His other two movies, I'm not sure if you've seen them or not, The Witch and the Lighthouse, do have this tendency of engaging a lot with this very charged spiritual, supernatural atmosphere. And I think he was attempting to do something similar in this movie as well. The idea came to him, and I'm going to quote here from an article in The Guardian. So he says that the macho stereotype of that history, the Viking history, along with, the right-wing misappropriation of Viking culture, made me sort of allergic to it, and I just never wanted to go there. So that was his initial thought. But his attitude shifted on a vacation to Iceland. He was very much impressed by the landscapes, which he described as being incredibly inspiring and prehistorical. And he also had some meetings with Björk on the one hand, and then with the famous Icelandic poet and novelist Sjón. So he attempted to make a more religious experience out of this Viking age, to turn a little bit into something a little more metaphysical than the classical epics, which I already said he wasn't really keen on. How much he succeeds in doing this is a completely different story. All right, so I am going to these are the movies I mentioned before. So The Witch, if you haven't seen them, is about some Puritans experiencing some sort of sorcery and supernatural while trying to live in an isolated community. And his other movie is The Lighthouse. It is about two Welsh tower keepers experiencing in their turn some kind of visions. And before I continue with this, I would like to draw the attention upon some theoretical considerations about media in general, and which I also consider to be helpful when discussing not only Viking movies, but medievalistic movies in general. And some of these theoretical approaches I've also used here. So my idea would be that when tackling the Middle Ages on screen, you basically create a shared cultural repository of symbols. And I'm going to quote Umberto Eco here: every new invention, so every new code, sets off a chain reaction and produces some sort of common language. So basically, all these aspects and elements we see in not only Viking movies, but medievalistic movies in general, have to have some kind of recognizability. Otherwise, they wouldn't be understood or perceived by the audience. So no text is read in isolation. All reading occurs within frameworks of intertextuality, or as Andrew Eliot defines it, we have a loosely affiliated array of ideas linked not only to a common purpose, but also by hyperlinks. So all kinds of references to not only medieval sources, but other movies as well. All right, and then we can also add that medievalistic media is both a product and a contributor to mythography. So basically what is being created is a new mythology, a customized version of the past, which remains recognizable and meaningful, but that is not to say that the modes of narrativization cannot be modified, or that the Middle Ages cannot be used to contradictory purposes. And when discussing a medievalistic movie, I also found useful the three steps that Andrew Eliot proposed, which is first the historical expropriation, that is the context of the appearance of a certain movie, for example, and then we have the retransmission, so that refers to the flattening out of the symbols, how symbols are used and reused or misused, and then lastly we have the ideological modification. So if a film, for example, brings some kind of innovation, civilization or other concerns, maybe religious concerns, political concerns, and so on, and how it is grafted onto modernity, basically. Now, with regard to Vikings in particular, overall, the medieval imaginary of the Vikings has been between a grotesque age consisting of excessive violence, disease, and death, and dirtiness overall. And on the other hand, we have this romantic, picturesque fantasy of knights in shining armor. And often an image is developed as a combination of several ideas, which can be classified as a fundamental dualism. I mean by this that both the negative and the positive can function together. This is, of course, always in relation to what the audience expects. Multiple Middle Ages can be created depending on the mediated iconography as well as collective memories. And Viking mythography revolves around this duality between barbarian and heroes. And this goes way, way back to the 1955 movie as The Perpetrators of Chaos, and up to the series Vikings, where they become these romanticized heathen figures, attempting to present civilization as a whole and a reversal of the trope of the civilizing Christianity and the barbarian heathen. However, whether positive or negative, they must always be exceptional. So the myth of exceptionalism is something I would say characterizes Viking movies overall. And this is heavily influenced by the nostalgia after heroes of the past, heroes of the mythical Nordic past, the poetic Edda, for example, and they are being endowed with all these virtues and talents from courage and a sense of duty, which are often felt to be lacking in the modern age. So there is this strange mix of trying to revive the past with some concerns about the present. So overall, there has been, in the past years at least, an attempt to overcome this image of the uncivilized other and to present the characters as also having moral conflicts. Nevertheless, despite these attempts, there are a lot of the old codes have been preserved. The figure of the Viking often represents a very specific form of masculinity, one that encompasses notions of violence, dominance, other aggressive traits. But on the other hand, we also have it as a more nebulous figure, as mythology shows itself to be quite flexible to the obsessions and requirements of the individual, the race, the age. At any rate, exceptionalism is what seems to characterize them. So there is this interplay between otherness, foreignness, and then familiarity. So the figure of the Viking has to be something recognizable, but that does allow some kind of modification as well. So on the one hand, we have a glorification of these delights of paganism, epic slaughter, heroism, excessive disorder. This can also be interpreted as a form of escapism. Then we should also remember that we have, regarding the Viking Age, different layers of interpretation which date back to the sagas themselves. So the sagas written in the 13th, 14th, 15th century in Iceland, and then all these layers overlapping with the Victorian Age, for example, and the nationalistic period, and the racist reception of the Viking Age in the 20th and 21st century, after all. So different layers of reception coming one after the other. What I have noticed as some kind of new orientation with these new series. So the three pictures you can see in the lowercase, they're from the 13th Warrior, the series Vikings, and a film called Valhalla Rising, is this attempt of trying at least to present some bits of mentality and not only focusing on what they do. So these epic adventures, which were actually what movies from the 50s and 60s focused on. All right, so coming back to this film, it does have a historical skeleton, so to speak. We have as a framework the story from Saxo Grammaticus. It's the story of Amleth, upon which Shakespeare's Hamlet is also based. But the story has been modified, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but perhaps one of the most important elements is the fact that the prince is not turning insane or stupid as he was initially, but he's turning into a berserker after his uncle kills his father. I also need to say that the story Saxo is telling us is much more complex than what the movie is providing. So the movie basically adopted this general pattern of a revenge tale with very few nuanced elements, I might say. Other sources include, well, a bunch of sagas. Robert Eggers actually took a lot of elements directly from the sagas, and no wonder he did that. He also had the help of two Old Norse scholars for that, Neil Price and Johanna Friedrichsdottir, who helped him reconstruct, or at least attempt to reconstruct, the age. So, for example, the idea of the magical sword is taken directly from this one, just one example, the saga of King Hrolf Kraki. Then he has the fight with the undead. Again, something you can find quite ad literam in the saga of Grettir the Strong. Then again, we also need to remember that these motifs have already been engaged with in other films as well. So he's not really inventing everything, but just trying to make it a little more believable. What he's attempting to do is to transfer all this material on the screen, and he wants us to regard this film as a proper saga. Which results in, well, this aura of factuality. It's a very immersive universe that he creates, but there is also a lot of hyperrealism involved, in the sense that there is this impression of weirdness, of the bizarre throughout the whole movie. Further on, I'm going to be discussing a little bit about what he's doing with material culture, and then with spirituality, and then about masculinity. So a new sense of realism is being offered here. The attention to detail is absolutely superb. So he uses all kinds of elements from the archaeological record and from the sagas as well to create this immersive universe. He has halls with all kinds of interesting details, scented pillars, hung fires, jesters, all these little details which add tremendously to a general sense of the age you don't really see in many other films. It's a very engaging universe, and it does not look artificial. However, it was darkened on purpose. The original pictures were much more colorful. The gloominess is part of the stereotype of medievalism, after all. On the other hand, you have a lot of other elements adding to this historical realism. I mean here the clothing, for example. You have riveted chainmails, penannular pins, patterned textiles, the use of helmets, and so on and so forth. Of course, the question remains as to how much of this really matters to the audience, say, without such a profound knowledge of the archaeology of the Viking Age. Now, this raises the question of accuracy, which is now left aside, in the sense of whether authenticity does help build a bridge between historical consciousness developing from scholarly work and the one resulting from popular engagements with the past. Then, of course, there is the question of relevance. I think it does help, at least it draws our attention to the fact that entertainment should also be an educational opportunity and not only remain as entertainment, or at least that was his approach here. Another novelty of the film, which I personally really liked because it was different from what I've seen before, is the representation of the sacred, and of the sacred not in the sense of this eternal fight between Christianity and heathenism, which I've noticed is quite the trope in Viking representation nowadays, but it is truly a heathen universe with no reference to any other kind of mentality. So we are in a universe without clear boundaries between reality and myth, which is again quite close to how ancient peoples would have imagined the world, populated by all sorts of either benevolent or evil spirits and driven by a fatalistic concept of fate, which transpires from multiple sources, starting with the closest one, with the poetic Edda. There is a lot of imaginative potential here, since sources about rituals are missing. And here I think such a movie could shine, because it could get one thinking at least about what a Viking way might have looked like. So he tries to reconstruct, for example, how the berserker would have acted and looked like. So these were these legendary warriors depicted in the sagas, but there are also some pieces of evidence that this might indeed have been a cult linked to Odin, even in the pre-Viking Age time. It is not very clear. I was a little bit unsatisfied with the fact that he chose to present them, but this is again a reiteration of the classical stereotype, to present them as naked and very well built. So they basically look photoshopped. This was not what they would have looked like in the age, and most definitely the most widely accepted linguistic explanation is that they were actually wearing bear skins, but that's just a little detail out of it. So you have, for example, here on the right side, these are the Torslunda plates. They are pre-Viking, and they hint to the existence of such a community. The film also deals quite lovely with the idea of shamanistic practices, sorcery, and so on and so forth. There is also an example of a sorcerer here, who, by the way, is one piece of evidence that the movie is not really that masculine, because he uses this little detail in the sense that in the sagas, for example, and in mythology in general, sorcerers were considered to be effeminate. So this activity comes with a price. It was considered to be a mark of ergi, that is of homosexuality, to engage with such activity. Nevertheless, they are so the sorcerer is depicted quite beautifully on screen. This is not the only instance of the supernatural in the film. You also have a prophetess, a vulva. You also have a Valkyria, with again all kinds of details to add up to this immersive universe. The feather skin used by the Valkyria, for example, and the blindness of the vulva. That's two more elements added to that. One more thing he uses is the Draugr, so the fight with the undead, and even the way the battle ends is taken directly from the saga. So he really does seem to care a lot about all these details. Which brings us to the final question of whether the way the hero is depicted is a twist on heroism or not. So I think that the classical duality regarding this masculinized Viking age is actually respected in the film, in the sense that we have both a hero and a barbarian. There's not very much we can make of him, but he does have this trait of exceptionalism. So he does make use of this trope. But the trope might be the point here to overuse it on purpose. So as Amleth is not playing the role of the fool, but he is a berserker. He has an aggressive form of madness. He is basically the peak of Western hypermasculinity. But as a character overall, he is weighed down severely by his story, because he's one-sided. He has no development. He's driven by his instinct, and very importantly by fate. So it's not really a masculinity he chooses. It's also very much related to this old concept of fatalism from all the Germanic religion. So he's not really made to be likable throughout the movie. His story is very linear and basically respects the tropes from Old Norse literature in a very general sense. So I can think that the film can be seen as a comment on hypermasculinity. So you can interpret the savagery as an escapist thrill, but also as a comment on toxic masculinity. There is a lot of ambiguity here. So the model presented is not really to be followed, but to be contemplated. There are scenes with these berserkers, for example, attacking innocent people and killing them for absolutely no reason. So there is a revival of traditional masculine tropes, but not necessarily as just one more example of them, but it can also be drawn to this idea of the alienating narrowness of contemporary masculinity. However, I do believe that not everyone can see the subtlety of this cinematic commentary. This is basically because of the storyline. So I think that the revenge storyline is determined by tradition and expectation. It's probably one of the oldest plots in cinematic history, and this is hampering its potential. It's a very simplistic story without nuance, and while a public from the 13th century Iceland could have dealt with it, I don't think a modern audience, I don't think it delivers for a modern audience, because it is extremely predictable and it is extremely linear. And the last aspect which would speak against a use of, this overstated masculinity would be the fact that women in this film do seem to have some kind of agency. They are manipulative and cunning, and they do manage to deal in their own way with the men in their lives. So as a conclusion, is it just another berserker on screen? Well, yes and no. I would agree that it is a part of a larger Viking mythography, and we do have this trope, this code of an interplay of something familiar with something unfamiliar, particularly this bizarre supernatural universe. And I would say as a conclusion that it is both a product and a contributor to Viking medievalism. It definitely has some parts where it shines through the depiction of the material heritage, for example, and through the depiction of Viking mentality. However, like I said before, I do find the lack of nuance of the narrative of the story itself as being quite limitative. So that was my contribution for today. A few books I used, generally speaking, about film, media, medievalism, and many thanks to you for listening.
Thank you, Irina, for your talk, and I'm sure it will spark an interesting discussion about masculinity, femininity, and authenticity. Hopefully. And last but not least, our last presenter is Máté Vas, PhD student at Eötvös Loránd University in doctoral program of medieval and early modern European history. He's working on a dissertation which is focusing on the recent questions about the late medieval masculinity, and it includes the examinations of sources like the Letters of St. Catherine of Siena and the biography of Charles IV. His supervisors are Dr. Gabor Klajnicaj and András Vadas. Máté will present a paper titled "This is How Silly Men Perished, Imagine Medieval Masculinities in the Green Knight." Máté, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. In 2021, David Lowery adapted Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. However, the main elements of the romance have changed for the purpose of that revisionist fantasy to present dilemmas of modern masculinities. The Green Knight portrays in an ambiguous way the following question. If masculinity is a status that must be won, and it can also be lost unless it is performed constantly in the right way in front of the viewers, what exactly is the right way? The aim of the presentation is to answer the following question. What is the function of the imagined medieval masculinities that we face in this work? As an introduction, I will talk shortly about the literature work in question. The story takes place in the idealized Arthurian past. I will follow John Burroughs' analysis about the romance. He argued that the poem is about truth and penance. Firstly, truth had a different meaning in those times. A true man was loyal to people, principles, and promises. He had faith in God. Besides, he was without deceit and he was honest and virtuous. According to the story, it's New Year's Eve. However, there is a strange visitor who would like to play an even stranger game. A volunteer can strike him down, but after that, he must endure the same blow. Sir Gawain accepts the challenge and cuts off the Green Knight's head, who is surviving it. 1 year passed away. Because of the given word, Gawain takes a long journey and spends some time in a second Camelot. This is Lord Bertilak's castle, where the host would like to play a game with his guest. They are exchanging gifts in each day. The Lord rides out to hunt. Meanwhile, Lady Bertilac is trying to seduce the knight, who will be a pride too, but Gawain keeps his chastity and he gets kisses from the lady, which he transfers to the Lord. Lastly, Gawain fails in the third day and accepts a magical green belt from the lady. She offers this time isn't love, but also life, because the belt can save his possessor's physical integrity. As Burrow pointed out, Gawain is in trouble because he should be courteous with the lady and loyal to his host, but both aren't possible at the same time. The virtues are interconnected, but this chain breaks when Gawain accepts the lady's gift in secret. There are other conflicting topics, for example, that Gawain should keep his promise, but also he shouldn't clinch to his own life. The poet is completely in love with these conflicts and he's searching the limits of the true man. In the Green Chapel comes to light that the Green Knight is Lord Bertilac under Morgan Le Fay's spell, who aims to destroy Camelot's renown. The Green Knight, like the judge of the final judgment, makes public Gawain's faults. The main message is that even the most noble knight should be humble because fear of death makes us human and even a near-perfect man has limits too. Gawain survives the encounter with the Green Knight, but he gets a neck wound, and in those times, a wounded man is a common symbol of a sinful man. Furthermore, he wears the green belt as a reminder of his faults. In that part of the presentation, I will talk about some recent investigations which are connected to the story. Ruth Mazer-Keres argued that there are multiple masculinities in the late medieval era too. For example, a knight must be a man in a different way than an artisan must, but every boy must somehow demonstrate that he became a man. Furthermore, masculinity is a relational concept. Firstly, the masculinities influence each other. Secondly, there are concepts of unmanliness, namely the femininity, the childishness, and the animality. Moreover, Derek G. Neal argued that an untrustworthy person can become unmanly too. Christopher Fletcher pointed out that the language of manhood was in a numerous case quite similar and the set of the values centered around honor and shame. He argued that scholars sometimes misled by the current social theory when they studied late medieval manhood like a quite similar phenomenon to our concepts of masculinity. Fletcher thinks this is a risk when we are trying to define the importance of sexuality inside the pre-modern manhood. In Lowery's adaptation, we see a Gawain who is not even a knight yet, so he must somehow earn the status of manhood. He's near 30, then 20, so his frustration is high. On that manuscript, we see Goliath in the picture of a knight and a rabbit who is probably David. Karras argued that the rabbit expresses more in that case the eagerness of the demonstration of manhood. We have a rabbit in the film too. Almost every critic said that this Gawain is a coward, anxious young man. Here, the time of Camelot, as Arthur himself is quite old and he's childless too. That's why Gawain is a possible successor. He doesn't live in chastity and he lacks of the self-control when he faces Lady Bertilac's seduction. But women aren't troublemakers in the story. Cindy Albito argued that in the writer's other poem called Pearl, the women's voices had been growing constantly from the flood and had caused increasing disorder in the society until the final judgment came. In the Gawain poem, Lady Bertilac speaks in every day much more than the previous day. In the end, Gawain blames all the women who seduce the near-perfect men like Samson, Solomon, and David. In the film, the women's voices create order rather than disorder. Firstly, Estelle, who is the protagonist's girlfriend, has the wisest advices in the story, and her task doesn't center around honor and chivalric issues. Secondly, Lady Bertilac is the writer of the later poem, who said that she likes to change the pieces of the stories for her own purposes, so she can rewrite the stories and make them appropriate. Thirdly, Morgan is a witch and also Gawain's mother, who would like to give her boy a great gift. but her magical ability has limits and she can't control the Green Knight. So the women's agency has serious limits in the film. Estelle lost Gawain, Lady Bertilac trying to create a story with an ideal knight, but these pure values exist only in their stories. Finally, Morgan trying to end her boy's aimless life state, but her magic isn't almighty, therefore she gives the first magic belt to his son. So the film told us that the way of Gawain's life isn't right and Morgan was correct to push him forward, but the goal, namely the chivalric masculinity, is problematic. Besides, there are characters who are the contrary of the mentioned women. More precisely, Gawain encounters some woman-like giants and he asks them to pick him up and let him sit in one of them's shoulders. But the giants don't help him, they don't even speak the same language. They are women, but uncontrollable ones, and their life goal isn't at all make to Gawain a better person. This is the key element of the film. Everything which exists outside of the chivalric masculinity is weird, non-urban, and non-Christian. There is a confusion in the reception of the Green Knight. What lesson does it teach us about honor? There are reviewers who said the lesson is simple. Honor is important and Gawain became a true knight in the end. PGC Field had an interesting observation. In the romance, Gawain won, but he isn't triumphed. On the contrary, Gawain triumphs in the film and he takes off the belt and accepts that the pursuit of manhood results his death. There is a vision, like in the Last Temptation of Christ, where Gawain sees what would happen with him if he would keep his life and he would run away from the encounter. He would be a powerful but also a bitter man. In the vision, Gawain wears always the magic belt as a secret symbol of his fear of vulnerability, and last but not least, he treats women like vehicles. As a king, he leads a losing war which caused his son's death, and after everybody disappointed in him, he takes off the belt and it seems that he pulls it from an open wound. Finally, after a sad, but in the view of his society, an honorable life, his head falls off. In the background, there is a photo which was made by Lady Bertilac with a camera obscura. There is another portrait in the film, a shiny one, which portrays Gawain before his journey as a powerful young man. But this one is dirtier, a more realistic one, not the image of the ideal manhood, but also it shows us the struggles behind the idea. In that scene, the king represents the social identity in practice. We can say it with Burroughs terms, the true man before the society and God, but in the background, there is a second personality, a private one, which contains all the hidden pain caused by the chivalric manhood. In the film, the Green Knight isn't Lord Bertilac, and he isn't under Morgan's spell. She's an overprotective mother and not a troublemaker. Besides, Gawain isn't a knight yet. He looks like a modern millennial person who is searching the meaning of life in a long-drawn adolescent period. We see some well-known topos here. Gawain lives with his mother, he is in a relationship, but he has commitment problem and he can't take enough responsibility. In the beginning of the film, he said, sweaty and hungover on the floor of a brothel, that he has time yet and he isn't ready to be a knight, which means rather to a modern viewer that he isn't ready to live like an adult. In the end of the film, he said to the Green Knight after the vision ends that he's ready now. The Green Knight said to them, well done, my brave knight. Now off with your head. In my point of view, the creature separates from the two ways of his life, the millennial-like masculinity, which caused pain to his loved ones too, and the hegemonic masculinity, which can cause suffering to an entire kingdom. These two masculinities are interconnected in the film. The first is a rebellion without a livable alternative. The second is enrollment to the status quo of society. And finally, Gawain also reinforces it. In that story, there are knights. In our reality, maybe managers, politicians, or influencers would be the bearers of hegemonic masculinity. In the vision, Gawain accepts the rules of chivalric masculinity, but it torments him this time more when he spent his years in the waiting room of adulthood. So, takes off the green belt means that he will be a dead man in two ways, in a biological and in a social way. Finally, Gawain said a confident denial to the hegemonic masculinity and the running from this manhood, which is also a type of harmful and isn't carrying an emotionally balanced way of life. The two masculinity cause pain to SL2. Before the journey, she interrogates Gawain. Why is it so important to be a great man? Why is goodness not enough? Actually, goodness isn't really possible in this world. Gawain is encountering two victims of the chivalric masculinity. Firstly, a Saxon young boy in a battlefield who would have liked to fight in the battle, but his mother forbid it. The denialist probably saved his life, but his brothers are dead. The scavenger boy told Gawain that he heard that Arthur killed almost 900 people during the battle. We know this isn't true in a literal way, but metaphorically, it is because with his decisions, Arthur caused the end of the soldier's life. We heard in the feast scene that Arthur sings, the Saxon people are like babies, on the contrary, his people behave like adults. So there is another image in medieval masculinity in the film, an imperialist one, which is attached rather to the colonialist period of Europe than the medieval era. So the scavenger gives the right direction to Gawain and he asks a kindness as a compensation. Firstly, Gawain said a simple thank you, so the gratitude is his kindness. After a little hassle, he throws a single coin to the boy. There are critics who argue that in that case, Gawain fails to act kindly as a knight should behave, and this shows us that he is a bad knight. It would be the great picture. I don't think so. In Lowery's world, knighthood means meaningless wars too, and it isn't possible to be a true man in a modern sense when we give some money to a refugee and after the donation we are continuing the war which turned him people ruled, killed or exiled. If Gawain would be generous, it doesn't mean that everything would be all right with the chivalric masculinity. Later, he encounters with Saint Winifred's ghost near a lake. The ghost has vague memory. There was a knight who stayed at her cottage and at night the man tried to rape her. She resisted, so the upset knight cut off his head and threw to the river. In some way, a rape is like a metaphoric mutilation because the rapist separates the victim's will who can't rule her own body onward. Gawain helped her to take his head back. Firstly, he thinks about the help as a transaction. Is he a bad knight? In my point of view, the other knight act originates also from the chivalric masculinity. However, there is a third masculinity which attaches to the men who are trying to rule the nature. In one scene, we see a harvested forest in the background. In another scene, Lady Bertilac has a long monologue about the green color, which means death and life at the same time, and the color expresses an uncontrollable force. As acolytes of horror pointed out, the Green Knight is the most masculine person in the film. He has the deepest voice, he's the largest, and he shows the least emotion. Finally, the substance of the Green Knight is the next. He's everything which is outside the mentioned masculinities. Nature and death are unconquerable forces. Death comes us anyway, and if we strike down to nature, someday nature strikes back. Even Morgan's magic couldn't control it. Firstly, the knight doesn't speak, he transfers a letter written by Morgan and it is read by the queen. After the beheading, the knight picks up his head and for the first time, he speaks in his own voice. 1 year hence. After that, we see two things. Morgan falls off inside of a tower where she leads a ritual and the knight rides out laughingly. Why would he laugh if he's still under Morgan's spell? Interesting that in the poem, Gawain and Arthur who are laughing, not the beheaded knight. So the domination inverts in the film. Furthermore, there is a scene when Gawain is robbed. One of the scavengers steps on his shield and it breaks into two sides. One of the pieces pictures Mother Mary, the other's baby Jesus. And Gawain lost his first magic belt too. Her mother pushed him on the stage of chivalric masculinity, but with extra protection. No, the safety net torns apart, and there is just permanent falling. Finally, I would like to point it out that in the film, there are two opposite father-like figures, Arthur and the Green Knight. In one scene, Gawain asks from Arthur why he wishes from him to finish the challenge. Arthur responds, "Is it wrong wanting greatness to you?" After that, he holds Gawain's face and wipes its right side because of the dirt. In the end, when Gawain is ready to endure the strike, the Green Knight holds his face and his hand is in the left side of Gawain's face. Arthur said to him before the journey, "If God smiles on you, come home to us." In the end, the Green Knight smiles on Gawain, but this isn't the homecoming which Arthur was thinking of. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Máté, for that detailed analysis. And now we will move to the questions and answers. In order to give some time to the public to think about the questions they would like to ask, I would like to start with a question for Amy. And Amy, you presented the male gaze, which I understood as depictions produced by men for men. And have you come across in your research to any depictions of women's hair painted by women? And if yes, do you see any distinctive differences between them?
Yes, I did look at a few female pre-Raphaelite artists when I was doing my research. And as I said, the film, while the costuming is done by men in the Stars production, the female actresses did have some influence in the costume. Certainly when looking at female pre-Raphaelite painters, there is a slight difference there. There are certainly visual through lines, especially in the aesthetic through lines, but I found that especially in the female art, women's hair is used in a more thoughtful way. So one painter in particular, the MacDonald sisters, who are producing art in Scotland, a couple of paintings by them, which really challenged, as one in particular that comes to mind of Salome and St. John, in which her hair it forms a part of it, but St. John also has this very long hair, and it forms this, their hair sort of twines together, and it's this very strange picture of a woman with a decapitated head, but in which their gender almost combines in this strange imagery, and there is a lot more questioning in the way that they're producing hair imagery, or especially the MacDonald sisters producing a more complex perspective of gender in their hair imagery than the male pre-Raphaelite painters.
Thank you. And my second question will be to Irina, and I think Máté also can comment on that. And I'm actually thinking out loud right now, because as far as I know, the concept of the toxic masculinity is the 20th century concept coined, I think, in 1980s. And I was just wondering how much those historical depictions of masculinity should be seen as toxic, and how much it was actually just the requirement of its time to be this hyper-masculine archetype.
Oh, should I start or?
Sure.
All right. So regarding this concept of toxic masculinity, I think Robert Eggers in the film could have played a lot more with the overall concept of masculinity, because while it is true that the Viking Age does have patriarchy as a norm of Viking society, it does get subverted in multiple ways. And he did attempt to do that with the image of the sorcerer, for example, in presenting something that wasn't, I wouldn't say it wasn't accepted, but it came at a cost, at this cost of social isolation or something like that. But then again, of course, you have Odin himself, the supreme god who does it himself. I mean, he is also a sorcerer, and he also has these feminine traits and so on and so forth. So clearly there is a tension here with regard to the gender boundaries. You can also see it in burials. You have burials of men with female torsos, tortoise brooches, for example. And then you have the famous burial at Birka, where you have a female with weapons. Now, if the attribution is correct, that would be something awesome. That doesn't mean automatically that she was a warrior, but anyway, she had these status symbols associated with her. So I think he would. I mean, I would have worked a little bit more on presenting this this concept in a more nuanced way. I think he limited very much himself to this overused trope of the berserker, which yeah, isn't even that important in saga literature, for example. So unconsciously, I think he had his own limitations, and his personal comments on the idea of toxic masculinity, which you could see in the film depicted through the destiny of the character, that he cannot escape his own manhood. I think it was limited by the way he did it. It was very, very subtle. I'm not very sure that a broad part of the audience really got that. I'm pretty sure that some people, as I've also read in many of the reviews, just perceived it as this, you know, movie filled with bloodlust, just another Viking movie playing with the same old. So I think he was maybe a little bit too subtle.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I was just wondering about this toxic masculinity, if we should actually, you know, look at those traits as toxic, or rather as something that it was just, you know, the archetype or the requirement of the time it was constructed.
In Lover's adaptation, I read a lot of articles which recognize that it is a comment on toxic masculinity, and there were some articles about that it is just medieval times, and this is a contemporary view of masculinity. But it's interesting that the millennial-like masculinity and chivalric masculinity, these opposite tropes, are equally toxic in the movie, and I think that is that's cause that that a lot of reviewers were confused of where are the right way out of man in this world, and there isn't a way, and that is why in the end Gavin accepts his death. I think that was an interesting choice to comment toxic masculinity, and it's an archetype, but not just an archetype, because it's intense modernization. For example, because of the millennial-like masculinity and the nature conqueror masculinity and other topos.
Thanks a lot. I can see that Juan is kind of wiggling. I guess he has a question.
Yeah, sure. So again, thank you to all our panelists for your presentations. I have a first question, which would be for Amy, but I think also directed to Irina. Of course, as you mentioned, the way in which the hair of these female characters is used and portrayed in these type of productions do symbolize different elements, whether she's dangerous or controlled or manipulative and such. And when you were showing your examples, the case that came to mind was the case of Lagatha in the series Vikings, which is a particular form of female character, which is both sexualized but also associated with a lot of male characteristics, mostly around her martial prowess. So I wanted to ask you, in this type, for example, of medieval characters, female characters that are trying to be portrayed as strong female characters, but end up just reproducing male ideas of strength. as happens with the case of Lagertha and Vikings, or as we had yesterday in the opening keynote lecture with Ivor in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, being, of course, very conscious that these are Viking characters, which is why I would also like to hear Irina's opinion. How do you see these variations in the way in which the female character in its physicality is constructed, including the way in which their hair is used?
Vikings, its depictions of women is quite complicated. It sort of goes between the character of almost Aslaug, and on one hand versus your idea of Lagertha on the other hand, and both of them are always portrayed visually very differently. And certainly as the series go on and Lagertha becomes a figure that becomes more empowered, but also shifts more into the male sphere and out of the female sphere. The way she dresses and the way she presents is very different to the way that she presents in the first series, for example, where she has more traditionally female coded roles and is seen more as the housewife and as the mother, and she's depicted very differently throughout the series. I think the Vikings series in particular is an interesting example, and it is certainly very influential in the idea of fantasy hair and sort of fantasy historical hair, with these sort of very heavily braided styles that you see in shows like Vikings, but also sort of crosses over into shows like Game of Thrones, with this idea of creating these really complicated looks, which are visually really striking. But again, you go into the idea of not so much the male gaze, but the active gaze of the audience versus the passive reality of the characters, are incredibly complicated and incredibly impractical for the use in which they are and the scenarios in which they're being presented, which you get both with Game of Thrones and with Vikings sometimes, where you have sort of female characters who are supposedly on, actively on campaign, yet somehow have perfectly braided and perfectly neat hairstyles, which are visually very striking, but not particularly practical within the world they exist in. And so whilst they are still their hairstyles set them aside from other more conventional feminine characters, they're still being produced in a way that is visually striking and visually appealing to the audience, sometimes at the cost of a practical idea of agency within the world they exist in.
Yes, I also want to say that I also interpret it as a form of empowerment, and yes, general part of this obsession with portraying Viking women as what we would like them to be, these strong, independent women, while yeah, I don't know, completely ignoring activities which were absolutely vital for the society in that day. So the value of women's work, for example, is also ignored in many of these representations, such as weaving, for example, for that matter. And this is actually something I did enjoy about the Northman, in the sense that the agency of women is closer to the agency we see represented in the Icelandic sagas, for example, in the family sagas, in the fact that a woman doesn't really need to be a warrior to have some kind of influence and role in this manly world. It's enough if she is cunning, or if she eggs on people, men around her, to do something in a certain direction. So you have, for example, a very powerful scene in the Northman where the character Olga, the character of Anya Taylor-Joy, tries to avoid a rape by showing her menstrual blood. So I consider that a very powerful image, and one example of how else we can represent agency in women.
Thank you. I would actually maybe like to continue on that thread for another question for you, Irina, because something that often, and I think it's something that Helen Young yesterday mentioned in her keynote, is that, of course, when dealing with the elements of Vikinghood, as you mentioned, often the more mundane type of activities necessary for the maintenance of society are ignored in exchange of the prototype of the warrior, the raider, the hyper-masculine Viking, right? And as you mentioned in your presentation, the director did have this intention of the whole film not being appropriated by the far right, but it was. And then I remember reading some pieces that I don't know if it was the director of the main actor who manifested surprise to the case that it was adopted by the far right, which in my mind actually surprises me why it would surprise them, considering the type of representation that is also using. So my question to you would be, to what extent do you think it's actually we can actually rescue the figure of Vikinghood in popular media so that it is not appropriated in this way? And my concern comes from something that I also researched, because with crusading it's something similar. Right now, I think there is an issue to what extent you can actually rescue crusading in popular media, considering how extremist movements love to use crusading. And I wonder if Vikinghood is kind of falling into the same category.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Well, for one, regarding this appropriation from the far right, I think they would pretty much appropriate anything coming from the Viking Age depicted, really, because they always tend to overinterpret what they see. And it wasn't a surprise to me either that they appropriated it. When I saw this movie, I was like, okay, this is going to be a disaster in that perspective. But yeah, then again, I think they're really overinterpreting it, because they are obsessed with this figure of the glorious, masculine figure doing something very moral, while the movie has absolutely no moral compass. Like I said, neither of these characters are likable. They're also obsessed with whitehood, and they, while the movie is white to a very large proportion, it does present cultural diversity. You do have hints of Celtic population there by the use of actors of Scottish descent playing the slaves, for example, and you do have cultural diversity by the use of Olga, for example, who is supposed to be a representative of the Rus, so this mix of Slavic Nordic culture in the East. But then again, I would totally understand why they would do that. So my proposition would simply be to try to, so that the directors try to take some distance from this warrior type. But I also acknowledge the fact that that's very, very difficult to do, because that's what the audience has been fed for the past, I don't know, 70, 80 years, 100 years, ever since the first movies were made. So I don't know, I think of something, but that's a very, very obscure film, the Saga of Gisli. That's an Icelandic movie. And then there was another one, The Flight of the Raven, I think it's called, was translated in English. And these two movies try to depict what people do on a farm, what their problems are on a regular basis. I don't know, somebody having a conflict with their neighbor over some sheep, over a meadow, or some kind of mundane activity, which can be also combined with stuff related to vengeance and family issues and so on and so forth. I mean, it is doable, and there are also very good sagas with a little more complex characters that could be good as material for making a film. The saga of Njál, for example, the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson. You do have material, but I think you also need the right people to do that.
Okay, thank you, Irina. If there are no other questions, then I do have a question for Máté, if I may, which I guess I will. I really enjoyed your presentation. I remember watching The Green Knight like a year ago. I know it was in a flight, so I'm not sure if I remember it correctly, because I was very tired. But I wanted to ask you something precisely regarding what you called like this vision that Gawain has at the end of the movie, when he doesn't die and he sees what his kingship would be. Because what seems to me, or the way I interpret it, and I might have missed this in your presentation, is that the movie kind of shows that the only masculine thing for Gawain to actually do is to die. Because when he becomes a king, he's something of a disaster of a king, and not only in his ruleship, but also in the fact that he's constantly afraid. Now, as I understand it, and I'm not expert in this, the original poem ends in a different way. And that would be my question. What do you think how do you think the film is commenting not only in the masculinity of the character, but also in how it is also portrayed in the original material, but making this shift in which Gawain needs to die at the end of the film?
How to comment the Gawain character in the film or in the poem?
Well, how the film is commenting on the character itself and on the poem.
On the poem, it is interesting that this character can reincorporate into his society, and because he admits his faults is he's not perfect, just near perfect, and he became humble, and all the Camelot became humble because not just Gawain who wears the green badge, but everyone, the nobles, wears green badge too, because he admits that he's humble, because it's not possible to become a perfect vessel. For example, you will have you will be afraid of death when you are serving your Lord. That's just, for example, one side notes of the poem. And yeah, it's a superlative test of a superlative hero, and he fails, but he won in the end. In the film, he triumphed because he shared in the end the view of the modern viewer that masculinity is we need masculinity needs a reformation, and we need to make that. We need to correct the faults of the past. This is the lesson of the film, in a short and in a not so sophisticated way. So I think this is the comment, and Gawain and the masculinity which is emotionally balanced and which is based on goodness. So living with asshole isn't possible in those words, and this is why Gawain choose death, because living isn't possible.
Thank you.
Do we have any question from the public? You can either type it in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and we will unmute you. Okay, so if there's no other question, I would like to thank the presenters for all of the insightful presentations. It was a pleasure to listen to you and to also learn from you a lot. Thank you to all of the people from the public who joined us in those 3 days. And I will also give the word to Juan, who wants to tell you something.
Okay, so this brings an end to our conference. I want to thank, first of all, of course, you and the Department of Medieval Studies for their support. Most importantly, I want to thank Carolina and Juan for helping me organize this event now for 3 years in a row. And of course, to all the panelists and the audience that joined us during these 3 days. I think it was a very exciting event. We heard papers about many different topics. And of course, also to remind all of you that we will be uploading these records to our YouTube channel, where you can also find our previous conference, the conference that we've hosted in the last 2 years. if any of you is interested, I am going to paste the link to the channel in the chat where you can access again our previous conferences, and where the panels from this conference will also be uploaded to. Again, thank you very much to everyone, and we hope to see you in a future iteration of Medievalisms on the Screen, and have a nice weekend.